Most stories start with a question, but this one started with a leash, a quiet trail, and a dog who decided to break routine. On the morning of Tuesday, September 3rd, 2024, Thomas Bell, a 62-year-old retired schoolteacher, was doing what he did every single day for the past 7 years, walking his dog, Hank, through the woods behind his property in rural western Wisconsin. Thomas lived alone in a small cedar cabin on the edge of Hickory Ridge, a sleepy patch of land a few miles from town. His days were simple. He woke with the sun, made a single cup of black coffee, read one chapter of whatever old book was on his kitchen table, and then whistled once. That's all it took. Hank would come running. Hank was a golden retriever, border collie mix, loyal to a fault, with intelligent eyes and a sixth sense that Thomas often joked could predict weather better than any forecast. Over the years, they had become more than just man and dog. They were a pair, a unit, two creatures stitched together by routine, silence, and mutual understanding. They had walked the same trail hundreds of times, a narrow path that curved along the base of the ridge and cut through a line of tall pines before looping back near a frozen stream. Thomas had memorized every route, every bend, every birdsong that echoed from the canopy above. But on that September morning, something changed. Halfway through their walk, just past the fallen log where they usually rested, Hank stopped. Not the kind of stop that came from fatigue or distraction. This was different. His ears perked, tail stiff, nose high in the air. He didn't bark. He didn't growl. He simply stood completely still, as if the world had paused inside him. Thomas tilted his head. "What's wrong, boy?" Hank didn't answer, of course. But a second later, he moved fast and low, off the path and into the brush. Thomas cursed under his breath and followed, pushing through thorns and low-hanging branches. "Hank, come on. That's not our trail." But Hank was already 20 feet ahead, zigzagging with purpose, like he was following a scent no human could ever detect. Thomas hesitated for a moment. Then instinct kicked in. He trusted that dog more than he trusted most people. So he followed. They moved deeper into the woods, farther than Thomas had been in years. The terrain grew uneven, the trees thicker, and then strangely quieter. No birds, no wind, no distant hum of town. Just silence. A kind of silence that wrapped around him and whispered something he couldn't quite hear. Then he saw it. Through the trees ahead, partially hidden by vines and years of overgrowth, was something that didn't belong. Wood. A wall. No, a building. An old structure, sagging at the corners, almost invisible in the brush. Thomas slowed his pace. "Hank, what is this?" The dog circled back to him, eyes alert, tongue out, tail now wagging slowly. Not with excitement, but with something closer to recognition. The structure was a barn. Or what used to be one. Long forgotten. Half swallowed by the woods. The roof had partially collapsed. The sides were covered in moss. A rusted weather vane still turned weakly at the top, creaking in the wind. Thomas had lived in Hickory Ridge for almost 3 decades. He thought he knew every inch of land within 5 miles. But he'd never seen this before. His pulse quickened. He stepped closer. The wooden boards groaned under his feet as he crossed what was once a front porch. A faded horseshoe was nailed to the wall, and carved into the frame, barely visible, was a name. Maddox Farm. He ran his fingers across it. The wood splintered like paper beneath his touch. Thomas looked at Hank, who sat quietly, as if waiting for something. A rush of memory hit him. That name. Maddox. He had heard it once before, years ago, at the local hardware store. An old man talking about a property that went missing during the war. Not torn down. Not abandoned. Just missing. He hadn't thought about it in years. Probably dismissed it as small-town gossip. But now, standing in front of a very real structure that wasn't supposed to exist, Thomas felt something stir in his chest. Curiosity. Wonder. And, underneath it all, unease. He pulled out his phone. No signal. He stepped inside. The air was dry. Dust floated like ash in the shafts of sunlight cutting through broken slats in the walls. Inside, time had stopped. Tools still hung on nails. An old wagon wheel leaned against a post. A rusted lantern sat on a shelf next to a stack of yellowed newspapers, dated October 1942. Everything was coated in decades of dust, but nothing had been disturbed. No graffiti. No signs of squatters. No animal nests. Just objects waiting. Thomas's breath caught as he spotted something in the center of the barn. A rocking chair. And on it, a blanket folded neatly. Too neatly. He stepped closer. The blanket was clean. No dust. No rot. It was wool. Green and cream plaid. Familiar. He reached out and touched it. Still warm. He turned to Hank, whose gaze hadn't left the chair. Thomas whispered, "What did you find, boy?" But the truth was already unfolding. And it started with the dog who refused to take the same path home. Something shifted in Hank after they found the barn. It was subtle at first, just the way he lingered by the doorway, tail low, ears stiff. But Thomas could feel it. The dog who used to sniff every wildflower and chase rabbits through open fields now walked like a soldier. Eyes sharp, movements deliberate. That night, Thomas barely slept. His mind kept returning to that blanket. Clean, warm, left on a rocking chair in a place that hadn't seen a living soul in decades, or so he thought. He had taken a few pictures with his phone, but when he tried to upload them back home, the signal blinked out. It returned later that evening, but the pictures were gone. Gone. As if they had never been taken. By morning, Wednesday, September 4th, 2024, he decided to go back. Not because he wanted to, because he felt like he had to, like something was unfinished. He poured himself half a cup of coffee, left it untouched on the kitchen counter, and whistled for Hank. The dog came running, tail wagging, but different again. Focused. Alert. The second Thomas reached for the leash, Hank pulled it from his hand with his mouth and walked straight to the door. No time to wait, huh? Hank barked once. They didn't take the usual trail this time. Not even the one that led them to the barn the day before. This time, Hank veered even farther to the right, past a fallen pine and into a dense part of the woods Thomas had never touched. Branches slapped at his arms. The sun was nearly choked out by the canopy. The farther they went, the more the air seemed to change. Colder. Heavier. And the silence returned. The kind that pressed against your skin like a weight. No wind. No birds. Just the crunch of leaves beneath their feet and the rhythmic swing of Hank's tail. Thomas kept calling out, "Where are you going, boy?" But Hank didn't slow down. He didn't even look back. That's when Thomas began to feel it, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. At first, he brushed it off his nerves. He wasn't 25 anymore. He was in his 60s. He'd seen enough horror movies to know how the mind plays tricks in the woods. But this was different. This wasn't imagination. This was presence. Twice, he stopped and looked around. Nothing. Just trees and more trees. But the feeling persisted, like eyes hiding behind bark, breath woven into the fog. And still, Hank led on. Eventually, the terrain began to slope. The earth became soft and uneven, as if it hadn't been walked on in decades. Vines tangled across the path. Halfway down the hill, Hank stopped cold. Thomas came up beside him, panting. "You better not have dragged me all the way out here for a squirrel." But Hank wasn't looking at any animal. He was staring straight ahead, at a wall of green. Not trees. Not hills. But vegetation. Grown over, twisted, impenetrable. Until Thomas stepped closer and realized what he was looking at. A building. No, the corner of one. The rest of it had been completely devoured by the forest. He cleared away a clump of ivy, revealing rotting wood and rusted nails. Another wall. Another structure. "Hank, what did you find this time?" The dog stood frozen, eyes fixed forward, like a sentry at his post. Thomas moved slowly, pulling back the vegetation. Vines peeled away like old wallpaper, revealing what had once been a side of a large house or barn extension. It was hard to tell. Nature had nearly won. But not completely. He found a door. Or the shape of one. The frame still stood, though the door itself was hanging off one hinge. He ducked inside. Dust filled his nostrils. The air was dry and oddly sweet, like rotting apples and wood smoke. Inside, the light was dim, barely slipping through the collapsed roof in thin, golden lines. But there was no mistaking what he was seeing. Another room. Fully intact. Tables. Shelves. A coat rack still holding what looked like a brown wool jacket. On the floor, an old boot. Still upright. Still laced. It was like someone had simply stepped out one afternoon and never came back. The strangest part? It wasn't the decay. It was how little there was of it. Yes, the place was old. Yes, it had been left behind. But there were no signs of wildlife. No signs of looting. No water damage. It was as if the forest had chosen to grow around it, but not through it. Thomas knelt by the coat rack and ran his hand across the fabric. Dust. But no mold. No rot. He reached into the coat's pocket and pulled out a crumpled envelope. The ink was faded, but he could still read the address. Mrs. Clara Maddox, Rural Route 6, Chippewa County, Wisconsin. The postmark was dated October 21st, 1942. His throat tightened. He looked back toward the entrance, where Hank still stood unmoving. "You brought me to a place time forgot," Thomas whispered. And somehow Hank knew to bring him here. He wasn't just pulling at the leash randomly. He wasn't sniffing squirrels or deer. He was following memory. Something deeper. Older. As if the ground itself had whispered to him. And now, the door to a long-forgotten life was open. Thomas didn't know how long he stood in the doorway, staring into the space that had no right to exist. The forest had done its best to erase it, to swallow it whole, but something had resisted. Something had preserved this place, like a memory refusing to be forgotten. It wasn't just one room. It was an entire structure, an old farmhouse, tucked into the land like it had burrowed in and hidden itself from time. He stepped outside and looked around. The trees parted slightly to the left, revealing more of the structure. A wide clearing opened up around it, obscured until now by overgrowth and shadows. The old barn stood about 20 yards from the house. Weather-beaten and hunched with age, it looked like it could collapse with a strong gust of wind. But it didn't. It simply stood as it always had, waiting. The boards were gray with time. Some warped. Some missing. Ivy crawled up the walls like veins on old skin. An ancient weather vane squeaked in slow, rhythmic protest at the top of the roof. The door hung off one hinge, half open, like it had been frozen mid-motion. And yet, there was something peaceful about it. As if time itself had drawn a circle around this land and said, "You stay. Everything else can go." Thomas approached the barn first. The smell hit him before he stepped inside. Dry hay, old rust, and something else. Faint. A trace of oil and tobacco. The kind of scent you remember from a place your grandfather used to take you. Faded but familiar. Inside, light filtered through the cracks in the walls and ceiling, casting beams across the dust that hovered in the air. Every step kicked up more. The silence disturbed only by the creak of the wooden floor beneath his boots. On the far side of the barn, hidden beneath a tattered canvas tarp, he found it. A tractor. Old. Red. Rusted along the edges. The kind built in the 1930s. Wide metal wheels, thick steering column, engine exposed. But here's what froze Thomas in place. It was intact. Not stripped. Not vandalized. Not overtaken by animals or rot. It had just been left. He walked around it slowly, hand grazing the hood. The seat still held the faint shape of the last person who sat there. Tools hung neatly on a nearby wall. Wrenches. Hammers. A rusted oil can. None of it was disturbed. He pulled the tarp further and noticed a small wooden crate beside the tractor. Inside were glass jars, some filled with nails, others with seeds. A label on one read, "Maddox, Fall 41 Sweet Corn." The Maddox name again. And the year before everything went still. Thomas turned slowly, eyes scanning the rest of the barn. A workbench sat under a broken window. On it, yellowed papers, a ledger book, and a dusty framed photograph. He picked it up gently. It was a family. A man, tall and clean-shaven, standing beside a woman with tightly curled hair and a calm face. In front of them stood a boy, no older than 6, holding a wooden toy plane. All three stared into the camera, serious but composed. The kind of photo taken when smiles were rare and time was too precious to waste on pretense. Thomas flipped the photo over. In neat handwriting, someone had written, "James, Clara, and little Eli 1940. James Maddox. Clara Maddox. And Eli." So it was real. This was their home. He looked back at Hank, who had stepped inside the barn and was now sitting beside the photo-covered workbench, eyes focused on the floor as if he already knew what lay beneath it. Thomas shook off the chill climbing his spine. They moved on to the house. The door barely held as he pushed it open. It groaned, then gave way. Inside, the temperature dropped. Dust clung to everything, shelves, chairs, a coat stand. But nothing had been touched by time's cruelty the way it should have been. No decay. No rot. Just age. In the living room, an old armchair sat angled toward a stone fireplace. A knitting basket rested beside it. The yarn still wrapped in a loose circle, like someone had set it down mid-row. Above the fireplace, a mirror, its surface fogged and spotted, but still reflecting the room like a memory. The kitchen was worse. Plates were stacked in the sink. A kettle rested on the stove, the enamel chipped but whole. A calendar on the wall was frozen on October 1942. The date circled in pencil. Pick up Eli from school, 3:30 p.m. Thomas ran his fingers along the edge of the table. The wood was smooth, worn from years of hands and elbows and mealtimes. A set of salt and pepper shakers still sat in the middle, tiny porcelain cows. He opened a drawer. Inside were bills, envelopes, faded coupons, and a single folded note written in sharp cursive. "We are being watched. I'm hiding this in case someone finds the house. We didn't leave. We were taken. No signature. No context. But enough to make his pulse spike." He turned to Hank, whose tail now stood still. Outside the window, the barn loomed in the distance. This wasn't just abandonment. It was interruption. Everything about the farm felt like it had been paused, not vacated. Not dismantled. Just paused. Like a book someone laid down mid-chapter, never to return. Thomas whispered, "What happened here?" But there was no answer. Only the wind brushing against the trees like a voice almost too quiet to hear. Thomas stood on the crumbling front porch of the Maddox house, the weight of silence pressing down on him like a lead blanket. Behind him, the woods whispered with wind. The barn loomed in the distance, and the sun had started to dip beneath the trees, casting long shadows across the forgotten clearing. Hank stepped inside first. Not a single bark. Not a single sound. Just a slow, steady walk through the door like he had been there before. Thomas hesitated. There was something about crossing that threshold again that felt different now. Heavier, as if the air inside had thickened with the years. Still, he followed his dog, one careful step at a time. The living room welcomed him with the same eerie stillness as before. Dust lay thick on the furniture, but there were no cobwebs. No broken glass. No damage. It didn't feel like a house that had been ransacked or abandoned. It felt like one that had been paused. He moved into the hallway, and that's when he noticed the family portraits lining the wall. Black and white photos in wooden frames, carefully arranged in a descending row. He paused at the third one. It was a candid shot, the kind rarely seen from that era. A young boy, maybe 6 or 7, laughing mid-run, a paper airplane clutched in one hand. Behind him stood a woman, Clara, holding a glass of lemonade and smiling with her whole face. In the corner of the photo, partially out of frame, stood the man, James Maddox, watching them with a quiet, unreadable expression. There was something tender in it, something fragile. Thomas continued down the hall. Hank had stopped at the end, in front of a door that was slightly ajar. He nosed it open. It was the master bedroom. The bed was made, perfectly. The quilt was thick, stitched by hand, patterned in deep greens and yellows. A single pillow. An indentation in the mattress like someone had sat there recently. Thomas stepped in slowly, eyes scanning the space. On the nightstand, beside a cracked lamp, lay a wristwatch. He picked it up. It had stopped. Exactly at 3:42 p.m. Not recently. The face was cracked, the hands unmoving. But something about it struck him as deliberate. Watches don't just stop at random. They usually fade slow, tick unevenly. But this looked like it had been halted mid-beat. He sat on the edge of the bed and opened the drawer of the nightstand. Inside were letters. Not many. Just 3. Each addressed to Clara Maddox, from someone named Annabelle G. The postmarks were from Duluth, Minnesota, dated between August and October of 1942. He unfolded the top one carefully. "Clara, you were right to be cautious. There are more trucks than ever. No uniforms. Just plain clothes and dark cars. They come at night now. I saw them near the West Orchard again. Tell James to burn anything he hasn't already. If they find it, I don't know what happens next. Love, Annabelle." Thomas read the letter twice. He could feel his heartbeat in his fingertips. Trucks. Plainclothes men. Something hidden. He opened the second letter. "Clara, I heard from Eli. He's okay. James did the right thing sending him early. But you must leave. I mean it this time. Don't wait for the harvest. If they catch you both, they'll erase everything. Not just the land. You. The name. All of it. Burn this. A." He didn't open the third letter. Not yet. Instead, he walked over to the dresser. Its top was covered in dust, except for one clear rectangle, as if something had recently been removed. A photo. A book. He pulled open the top drawer and found what he didn't know he'd been looking for. A diary. Small. Bound in cracked leather. No lock. The first few pages were blank. Then, in soft pencil strokes. March 3rd, 1942. "James says we're being watched. I laughed at first. Said he'd been listening to too many war broadcasts. But last night, Someone came to the property line. Didn't knock. Didn't say anything. Just stood there. James didn't sleep. Thomas turned the page. March 29th, 1942. They're asking questions in town. About the farm. About James's father. I told the man we've lived here for 20 years. He said records show only 15. That's not possible. James was born here. But the man wouldn't leave. He asked to see the cellar. Cellar? Thomas glanced around the room, then down at the floor. He kept reading. April 15th, 1942. James burned his journals. All of them. He said it was safer that way. I wanted to keep them, but he said they had names in them. People. Places. Things he saw that weren't supposed to be written down. June 2nd, 1942. Eli's school called. They said he was never registered this year. That they have no record of a student by that name. I told them he's been there every day. The woman on the phone said I must be mistaken. That his classroom is empty. Thomas felt a knot form in his chest. He flipped ahead, scanning the final entries. October 19th, 1942. James says we have 1 day left. He buried the files. I don't know where. I'm writing this in case someone finds it. We didn't run. We didn't disappear. We were here. We existed. There were no more pages. Thomas set the diary down slowly. He looked at Hank, who had curled up on the floor, eyes wide open, watching. You led me here for a reason, Thomas whispered. This wasn't just a mystery. This was proof. Proof of something that someone had tried very hard to erase. And now it had been found. Thomas sat in the quiet bedroom of a house that time forgot, the diary resting in his hands like something sacred. The pages were worn but intact, the graphite strokes soft and careful. Each word felt deliberate, like the writer had known someone might one day need them. It was clearly Clara's handwriting, steady at first, then more frantic as the entries continued. The first entries were dated early in the year, filled with details that painted a picture of everyday life during a time when the world was unraveling. January 15th, 1942. James built shelves in the barn today. Eli helped. It's been cold, but the stove holds. He keeps reading the newspaper like he's waiting for something. I think the war's gotten into his head more than he admits. Thomas flipped to the next few pages. They were filled with subtle shifts, moments of tension creeping in like a shadow under the door. February 3rd, 1942. James said someone came by the fence line. Didn't speak. Just stood there. He had no reason to lie, but I didn't see anyone. Hank wouldn't stop barking for 10 minutes. Maybe it was just a traveler. That name stopped Thomas. Hank. The same name. He looked at the dog now curled at his feet, peaceful, still, as if listening even in sleep. He kept reading. March 8th, 1942. James doesn't trust the mail anymore. Says letters are being read. He asked me not to write to Annabelle again. But I did. I needed someone to talk to. He burned the envelope before I could send it. He's changing. Then, a few entries later. April 21st, 1942. There's a man who walks past the property every third day. Always the same coat. No hat. No dust on his shoes. Just passes by, looking straight ahead. I waved once. He didn't blink. Eli says he saw him watching from behind the silo. Thomas turned the page slowly, his fingers trembling. May 9th, 1942. The radio won't stay tuned. Every time we get to the news station, it cuts to static. But not random static. There's a rhythm to it. James started writing down the pulses. He says it's Morse. I told him that's ridiculous, but I'm not so sure anymore. By now, Clara's tone had shifted. Less doubt. More fear. June 13th, 1942. James is hiding things. Papers. Maps. I saw him in the barn late last night. He had the lantern lit. I asked him what he was doing. He said, preparing. That was all. He looked hollow. Like someone I didn't recognize. July 29th, 1942. The bank called. They said our account doesn't exist. That there's no record of our mortgage. I went into town. Our name isn't on the county deed anymore. The clerk said Maddox Farm was dissolved in 1937. But I was married here in 38. I gave birth to Eli in this house. What do they mean it doesn't exist? Thomas closed the diary for a moment, breathing in the dusty air of a room that had not changed in over 80 years. He had come out here chasing a dog, just like any other day. And now he was holding the unraveling of a woman's life in his hands. He opened to the next entry. August 15th, 1942. We can't get word out. Not through mail. Not through phone. The neighbors won't answer their doors. James said someone came at night. Knocked 3 times, then walked away. Left no tracks. Just the smell of oil and pine needles. Thomas turned the page, and something inside him tightened. September 4th, 1942. Eli is gone. That was all. No explanation. Just those 4 words. Then, September 5th, 1942. He was here when I made breakfast. Said he was going to the barn. I heard the door creak. Then nothing. I went outside, but he was gone. James searched the whole clearing. Found nothing but the toy plane. No footprints. No sign of a struggle. He was just gone. September 6th, 1942. James doesn't cry. He just sits now. Silent. He hasn't eaten. I don't sleep. We don't talk. Only Hank watches the window. Thomas had to pause again. The diary felt heavier now. More like evidence than memory. He kept reading, even as the handwriting began to change. More erratic, quicker, darker. October 1st, 1942. They want the barn. That's what this has been about all along. Not the house. Not us. James built something down there. Something they don't want found. He says it's just notes. Just papers. But I think it's more. I think it's why they came. October 10th, 1942. He buried it. Said if they find the house, it doesn't matter. The truth is beneath the barn floor. Where the light falls through the roof, he said. You'll know where. And then, the final entry. October 12th, 1942. They're here. I can see them. They don't wear uniforms. They don't knock. They just walk toward the door. James told me to hide. But I can't leave him. If someone finds this, please tell Eli we never left. Tell him we loved him. Tell him we existed. The last sentence had been smeared, as if her hand had been yanked away mid-word. There were no more pages. Thomas stared at the final line, his heart thudding in his chest like a distant drum. This wasn't folklore. This was a family erased. A woman who watched the world collapse around her, while everyone looked the other way. And now, after all this time, the pages she wrote in desperation had finally been read. By the next morning, Saturday, September 7th, 2024, Thomas had barely slept. The weight of what he had read in Clara Maddox's diary pressed into his chest like a stone. He couldn't shake the feeling that the silence surrounding that house had somehow seeped into him, following him home like invisible fog. He sat at the kitchen table with a cup of black coffee, staring at the cracked leather journal he'd brought back. Next to it, the 3 letters from Annabelle G. lay neatly unfolded, as if waiting to be reread. Hank lay on the floor, unusually quiet, as if he too understood the gravity of it all. Thomas picked up his phone and began searching. Property records, historical maps, county registries. He started with the basics: Maddox Farm, Chippewa County, Wisconsin. Nothing. No current listings. No historical markers. No obituary records for Clara or James. No birth certificates for Eli. It was as if they had never existed. No census data. No deeds. No mention. It made no sense. He opened an old PDF file of a 1940s plat map he found on the Chippewa County Historical Society's website and scanned it until his eyes burned. There it was, barely visible, a hand-drawn boundary labeled Maddox, tucked into the southern edge of a larger farmland plot. But when he opened a map from 1947, the name was gone. The land was marked simply as Forestry Development Area. Erased. He grabbed his truck keys and notebook and whistled for Hank. They drove straight into Chippewa Falls, stopping first at the county courthouse. The archives were open but sparse. He asked for any records related to rural Route 6 or the Maddox family. The clerk, a gray-haired man with thick glasses, gave him a blank look. Maddox Farm? Thomas asked again. The clerk paused. Then he tapped his pen against the counter and said, "Can't say I've ever seen that come through here. You sure it's Chippewa? I've been to the house. It's still there." That got the man's attention. Still there? That place was burned out decades ago, wasn't it? No. It's intact. Frozen in time. The clerk frowned and disappeared into the back. He returned with a dusty folder labeled Undesignated Land Parcels, 1930s, 1940s. Most of it was faded tax documents and hand-sketched maps. But one sheet, dated October 23, 1942, caught Thomas's eye. A notice of seizure. From the federal government. Property: Rural Route 6, Maddox Farm. Reason: classified under Emergency Provision for Strategic Development. No further information listed. Thomas looked up. Strategic development? The clerk shrugged. Could be anything. World War II changed a lot around here. Some places were bought out for training grounds. Some just vanished. That word again. Vanished. He left the courthouse with more questions than answers. His next stop was the local diner just off Main Street. The kind of place where time moved slow and stories moved fast. He ordered a coffee and waited until an older gentleman took the stool beside him. His name was Walter Briggs, retired mechanic, born and raised in the county. 84 years old, sharp as a blade. Thomas mentioned the Maddox farm casually, expecting a shrug. Instead, Walter blinked twice. Now there's a name I haven't heard in, must be 50 years. You remember them? Not them, no. I was a boy. But my dad told me stories. Said folks near that land heard strange things. Like machines humming underground. Lights that flickered in the trees. A whole family that stopped showing up at church one day. People said they moved. Others said they didn't. Did anyone go looking? Walter chuckled, but it wasn't warm. Back then, you didn't ask too many questions. Especially when the sheriff told you not to. That chilled Thomas more than the autumn air outside. He pressed further. I found a diary. Said people came at night. Took them. Walter looked at him for a long moment. There's always been talk, he finally said. Talk of a place the government tried to erase. A piece of land with a house that shouldn't be there. People call it the ghost farm. But here's the thing. If you ask around too loud, that name disappears from people's memory real quick. Thomas leaned in. But you never forgot it. Hard to forget what your father whispers to you the night before he dies. Walter sipped his coffee. Said it was more than just a farm. Said that land had roots too deep to pull up clean. Said the earth holds memory. Some things don't want to be uncovered. On his way out of the diner, Thomas scribbled a note in his notebook. They didn't just disappear, they were removed. Back at home, he laid everything out on the dining table. The diary, the photos, the letters, his courthouse notes. He took a red marker and circled the key words. Seizure. Silence. Strategic. Secrecy. Everything pointed back to that final fall of 1942. And to the barn. The truth wasn't buried in files. It was buried in soil. Thomas thought he'd reached the limits of what the Maddox farm could reveal. He had Clara's diary, the ghost town whispers, and county records stamped with silence. But it wasn't until he returned to the house one crisp Sunday afternoon, September 8th, 2024, that something truly shifted. He and Hank walked the familiar path again, through the tangled brush and the whispering trees. The air felt thicker, like the forest had drawn a breath it wasn't ready to release. Thomas didn't speak. Neither did Hank. This time, he wasn't there just to investigate. He felt drawn. The sun hung low over the horizon, casting golden light across the broken windows of the house. Dust danced in the air as Thomas stepped inside, each footstep echoing louder than it should have. He made his way to the hallway where the family portraits hung, now slightly tilted from time and weather. That's when he noticed it. One photo, smaller than the rest, had fallen behind the cabinet. Only a corner stuck out, wedged in the crack between wood and wall. He crouched, reached in, and carefully pulled it free. The photograph was faded, curled at the edges, but the image was still visible. A young man, seated on the edge of a well. His hair slicked back, a confident smile on his face. The handwriting on the back read, For Thomas, Spring 1940, your uncle James Maddox. Thomas froze. He read it again. Your uncle. He turned it over. The face stared back, the same man from the family portrait with Clara and Eli. James Maddox. Uncle? That wasn't possible. His family tree had always been simple. His father, Harold Mitchell, born in Milwaukee in the 1950s. His grandfather, John Mitchell, born in 1922. No Maddox. No James. He stood there, stunned, while the forest seemed to press in closer through the broken glass. Uncle? He took the photo and the diary back home, spreading them out under the soft light of his study lamp. He booted up his laptop and started digging. Old census records, digital archives, scanned church registries. Then it hit him. His grandfather, John Mitchell, had never spoken much about his early life. When Thomas was young, he'd asked once where the family came from. North Woods, John had said. But that place doesn't matter anymore. Now, Thomas pulled up the 1930 census. There, in Chippewa County, was a record. James Maddox, 20 laborer. Clara Maddox, 18 homemaker. John Maddox, 8 brother. Brother. His grandfather. He double-checked it 3 times. Somewhere between 1930 and 1950, John Maddox had become John Mitchell. A name change. A deliberate erasure. Thomas stared at the screen, stunned. His grandfather had erased his name. His roots. His entire family history. But why? Why abandon the Maddox name? And why never speak of it again? He opened a dusty box in his closet, where he kept some of his grandfather's old belongings. A pocket knife, a coin collection, a few black and white photos from the 1950s. One photo was a boy in front of a barn that looked eerily familiar. He turned it over. John, aged 10, before leaving the farm. His heart skipped. It was real. The Maddox farm wasn't just a mystery anymore. It was his mystery. His blood ran through the floorboards of that house. His name had once echoed through those woods. The story of Clara and James wasn't some forgotten tale. It was his family's buried truth. The name change suddenly made sense. If what Clara wrote was real, if the family had been targeted, watched, even erased, then John must have escaped. And he ran hard enough to bury the name behind him. Thomas sat back, letting the weight of it all settle in. His quiet life in the woods. His unusual connection to the land. His inexplicable bond with Hank, a dog who seemed to know where to go, what to find, how to lead. None of it was coincidence. It was inheritance. A story passed not in words, but in instinct. In memory. Suddenly, the pull he'd felt toward the place wasn't curiosity anymore. It was duty. He had to know what happened to James. To Clara. To little Eli. He had to uncover the truth that someone had tried desperately to bury. He reached for the diary again and flipped back to Clara's final entries. The last one had said James buried something beneath the barn floor, where the light falls through the roof. A message left not just for anyone, but possibly for him. A descendant. A witness. Thomas closed the book and stood. Tomorrow, he would return to the barn. And this time, he wouldn't leave until he found what James had hidden. By Monday morning, September 9th, 2024, the weather had shifted. The wind was sharper. The sky hung low and heavy, the clouds dragging across Wisconsin like bruises on an old wound. Thomas woke drenched in sweat. Another dream. No, not a dream. Something else. It felt too real, too vivid, like he had walked through another life wearing his own skin. He had been in the Maddox house again. But this time it wasn't abandoned. It was alive. Clara stood at the window, rocking a baby in her arms. James paced the room with a rifle. A fire crackled in the stove, and somewhere in the distance, a knock, 3 slow, deliberate raps, echoed through the walls. Then silence. Then the scream. Thomas had jolted awake, heart racing, mouth dry. Hank was already sitting beside the bed, staring at him with wide, unblinking eyes. The dog hadn't made a sound, but Thomas knew. He'd sensed it too. The dreams kept coming. Night after night. Each one more intense. Clara calling for Eli. James burying a box under flickering lantern light. Sometimes Thomas would see himself walking through the halls, but it wasn't him. It was someone else. Someone who belonged there. And then the worst dream. He was in the barn. Alone. He lifted the floorboards. Reached down. But instead of finding something buried, the earth pulled him under. He woke screaming. And it wasn't just the dreams anymore. Things were happening during the day. The first sign came that afternoon, when he returned to the farm. He brought a shovel, rope, and flashlight. His plan was clear. Locate the beam of sunlight Clara had described, remove the boards beneath it, and dig. Simple. But nothing about that place ever stayed simple. As he approached the barn, he stopped cold. Footprints. Fresh ones. Too large to be his. He wore hiking boots. These were wide, deep, military grade by the look of them. And they weren't old. The dew hadn't even dried where the grass had been pressed. Someone had been here. Maybe still was. He scanned the tree-line. The forest stood still. But it felt wrong. He walked toward the barn slowly, listening for anything. A snapped twig, a breath, anything. Hank growled low in his throat, ears pinned back. He stayed close to Thomas, never more than a few inches from his leg. Inside the barn, the air was thicker than before. Dust floated like ash. And then came the noise. A click, sharp and sudden like metal tapping wood. Thomas spun around, flashlight drawn. Nothing. But then it came again, this time followed by a whisper. Not a voice. Not language. Just breath, low and ragged, like something trying to speak without words. Thomas backed away, heart pounding. Hank, he whispered. The dog growled deeper now, staring at the floor where the old boards creaked slightly, just under the far wall. The light. It came through the roof, just as Clara had written. A narrow shaft of gold sliced through the gloom, landing on a particular section of floorboards, slightly newer than the rest. Thomas stepped forward and dropped to one knee. He placed his hand on the wood. Warm. Too warm. He pried the first board loose. And that's when he heard it. Leaves crunching outside. A footstep. He stood up fast, shovel ready, eyes locked on the door. But no one came. He stepped outside. The clearing was empty. But there, just at the edge of the trees, a shadow moved. Not walked. Slid. Gone in an instant. He tried to follow, but Hank barked, loud, sharp, panicked. Okay, Thomas muttered, backing off. We'll come back. That night, the dream returned. But it wasn't a dream. It was him, standing in front of a mirror. But the reflection wasn't his. It was James, older, wearier. Behind him, Clara's voice. They're watching again, Tommy. You need to go deeper. It's not just us they erased. He woke gasping, hands shaking. And on his nightstand, though he knew he hadn't brought it home, sat the wristwatch. James's watch. Still stopped at 3:42 p.m. His breathing slowed. He checked the front door. Locked. Windows. Closed. No signs of entry. He stared at the watch for a long time before picking it up. It was ticking. Just once. A single click. Then silence. That was the moment he realized something was wrong with him. He wasn't just experiencing the past. It was bleeding into him. Or maybe he was bleeding into it. He started hearing things in daylight now. Clara humming a lullaby, the rustle of paper in an empty room, a child's voice calling Mom, from just behind his shoulder. He began to question everything. Was he imagining it? Was the isolation getting to him? Or had he gotten too close to a truth the world had buried for a reason? Whatever the answer, one thing was certain. He was no longer alone out there. Hank began acting differently too. No longer playful. Always alert. Barking at shadows. Growling at corners of the room that looked empty. And once, just once, he refused to go near the barn at all. Thomas had tugged the leash gently, but Hank dug in. Eyes wide. Breathing shallow. Refusing. That night, the last dream came. This time, he saw a man standing by the well. His back was turned. In one hand was the watch. In the other, a box. When the man turned around, Thomas wasn't surprised. It was himself. You know where it is, the reflection said. You always knew. And then silence. Darkness. He woke up on the floor, hands trembling, and Hank whining softly beside him. Whatever he was facing, it was changing him. But he couldn't stop now. Not when he was this close. Not when the shadows were starting to speak. It was Tuesday, September 10th, 2024, and Thomas knew this would be the day. No more waiting. No more hesitation. The past had pulled him in too deep to stop now. He returned to the Maddox farm with his tools, his resolve, and Hank walking silently at his side. The morning light broke through the clouds just as they reached the barn. The same golden beam Clara had described in her diary spilled through a crack in the roof, falling on a precise spot on the floor. A signpost from the past, steady and deliberate. Thomas knelt by the beam. The wood groaned under his weight as he pried up the planks one by one. Beneath the floorboards was not soil but a thin layer of rusted metal. A trapdoor. He gripped the handle, old iron cold, and pulled. It screeched open like a scream. A stairway descended into shadow. The air that wafted up was dry, but not dead. It held the scent of paper, dust, and something else, ozone. Like old electricity trapped for generations. Thomas clicked on his flashlight and began the descent. Hank followed reluctantly, ears low, tail stiff. The steps creaked beneath his boots. 10 in total. Then the floor. A room no bigger than a cellar. Lined with shelves. Stacked with boxes. An old wooden desk sat in the corner, its drawers cracked open. A rusted chair was still pulled out, like someone had just stood from it. And in the center of the room, a large steel cabinet. Locked. Thomas searched until he found a small key tucked behind a loose brick. He inserted it. Click. The cabinet swung open, and inside were relics that didn't belong on a farm, not in 1942. First, a radio transceiver, military grade, still intact. Wires coiled, tubes in place, microphone resting atop a leather-bound logbook. The dials were marked in a language Thomas didn't recognize at first. Not English. Not even German. Symbols. Ciphers. He flipped through the logbook. Entries written in hurried script. Transmission failed. Frequency jammed. Reattempting contact. Then a name he hadn't seen before. Project Dandelion. Underneath the radio, tucked in a manila envelope yellowed with time, were maps, aerial photos of rural Wisconsin. But not just this farm. There were red circles around 4 other locations. Government facilities, training grounds, experimental sites, all dated between August and October 1942. Next to the envelope, a bundle of papers, brittle and stained, typed memos with War Department letterheads. Most were redacted, entire lines blacked out, but the words that remained chilled Thomas to the bone. Civilian research compromised. Property absorbed for use in classified communications testing. Subjects aware of surveillance. Containment advised. Authorization granted for erasure. He whispered the word aloud. Erasure. Then he found it. A torn sheet of stationery. Handwritten in Clara's unmistakable cursive. To whoever finds this, please, if this gets out, let them know we weren't crazy. They used us. They told James it was just a listening post. But the signals weren't normal. He found patterns. Messages that didn't come from any base. And when he tried to stop, they came at night. I tried to warn the church. I wrote the senator. No one answered. This is my last chance. Please don't let them erase us. Below her signature, October 12, 1942. The same date as her final diary entry. It was her last attempt, a message never sent. Thomas slumped against the wall, breath shallow. The room wasn't just a shelter. It was a witness. A grave for the truth. As he sat there, trying to process the weight of it, he noticed something carved into the underside of the desk. Rough, simple letters, etched with a knife or maybe a nail. Tell Eli. 3 words. A mother's last wish. Hank rested his head on Thomas's knee, grounding him. The silence in the room was not empty. It vibrated with memory. He took photos of everything, the documents, the radio, the carvings, then carefully gathered the items and packed them into a crate he'd brought with him. He'd deliver them to the authorities, yes. But more than that, he'd make sure the Maddox family's story was told. As he prepared to leave, he turned one last time and looked around the cellar. He imagined James hunched at the desk, fingers trembling as he tuned the radio. Clara writing by candlelight. Little Eli sitting on the stairs, waiting for his father to finish so they could go inside. This place wasn't haunted by ghosts. It was haunted by secrets. And now, at last, someone was listening. Back in the sunlight, Thomas sealed the trapdoor and placed the boards gently back into place. Not to hide the truth, but to honor it. He looked at Hank, who sat quietly beside him, eyes steady. Thomas nodded. We're not done yet, boy. But we're getting close. By Wednesday morning, September 11th, 2024, Thomas felt like a different man. He had crossed a threshold few ever encounter. Not just uncovering history, but becoming part of it. The box he'd packed now sat in the back of his truck, wrapped in a blanket and strapped tightly against the cab. Inside it, relics from a past the world had forgotten. Or maybe tried to forget. He didn't drive to the local sheriff this time. This wasn't something you handed off to a man with a badge and a small-town office. This was federal. He took the 2-hour drive south to the federal building in Eau Claire, a brick fortress with metal detectors, mirrored glass, and a long, sterile hallway that echoed with every footstep. At the reception, he stated clearly, I need to speak with someone from the Department of Homeland Security. I've uncovered materials from the Second World War that I believe were part of a classified project. The contents may include unreported government equipment and documentation involving unauthorized civilian surveillance. The woman behind the glass blinked once, then reached for the phone. Within 30 minutes, Thomas found himself in a quiet interview room with a plain gray table, 2 chairs, and a middle-aged man in a navy blue suit who introduced himself simply as Agent Brooks. Thomas placed the box on the table, unwrapped the blanket, and opened the lid. He didn't say much after that. The items spoke for themselves. The moment Brooks saw the radio equipment and the logbook, his posture changed. He leaned in closer, squinting at the writing, flipping through the maps and documents slowly, carefully. Thomas watched him closely. Brooks wasn't confused. He wasn't surprised. He was calculating. After 10 minutes of silence, Brooks closed the logbook and looked up. Where did you find these? Thomas hesitated, then said, on private land. My family's land. A farm that belonged to James Maddox. My great-uncle. Brooks folded his hands. And how did you come across it now? A dog walk. Then a diary. Then everything else followed. Brooks nodded slowly, like he'd heard stranger things. You realize what you're holding here, Mr. Mitchell. maybe part of an undocumented intelligence project from the early 1940s. I figured that much. Have you told anyone else? Thomas paused. Not yet. Brooks exhaled, then stood. Wait here, please. He left the room with the box, leaving Thomas alone in silence. 30 minutes passed. Then a full hour. When Brooks returned, he wasn't alone. Another agent entered, a woman this time, and introduced herself as Special Investigator Reed from the National Archives Historical Recovery Division. She smiled, offered a handshake, and said, Mr. Mitchell, we owe you thanks. Over the next hour, they asked him detailed questions. About the location. About the documents. About the conditions of the site. About what had led him there. He answered everything honestly. When they finished, Reed looked down at her notes and said, We've confirmed your find isn't part of any currently catalogued operations. But based on what you've shown us, Maddox Farm may have been used as a low-level field communications test site for signal disruption or covert broadcasting. The program you're referring to, Project Dandelion, has only appeared in a handful of heavily redacted memos. Most of them were thought to be fakes. They're not fake, Thomas said. Clara Maddox kept a record. She was trying to warn someone. Reed nodded. And she may finally have succeeded. We're opening an internal review. A historical investigation. And the family? Thomas asked. The Maddoxes? Reed looked at him for a long second. There's no evidence that they were officially recorded as project assets, which means they were likely civilian casualties. And if that's true, what happened to them might have been buried on purpose. It was difficult to swallow. Not just because it confirmed the worst, but because it also meant Clara had been telling the truth all along. Before Thomas left, they handed him a signed statement acknowledging receipt of the materials and confirming his role in their recovery. They couldn't offer many details yet, but they assured him a full investigation would follow. And quietly, Brooks added, You'll be credited for the find, possibly even cited in the final report. Thomas didn't care about credit. He cared about truth. Later that week, back in Chippewa Falls, word began to spread. Local news outlets ran a small segment. Local man uncovers forgotten World War II site in northern woods. The story was vague, no mention of Clara or Project Dandelion or erasure. But it was enough. People started asking questions. Neighbors he hadn't spoken to in years stopped him at the gas station, asking if it was true. If the farm up on Route 6 really held a secret. If the stories their grandparents had whispered were more than just ghost tales. Even Walter from the diner showed up at his door, holding a yellowed photograph. I think this was your uncle, he said. My father took it back in 1941. Said he met a man who could hear voices through the wires. Thomas took the photo, eyes misting. It was James, standing by the well. Proof. Recognition didn't come in the form of headlines or medals. It came in shared memories, unspoken nods, and a shift in the air, like the town itself was finally exhaling after 80 years of holding its breath. The Maddox family had been erased. But not anymore. By Saturday, September 14th, 2024, the Maddox farm didn't feel haunted anymore. It felt hallowed. The morning sun filtered softly through the thinning trees, painting long golden stripes across the barn's faded red siding. The air was crisp with early autumn, and for the first time in weeks, Thomas felt peace, not just around him, but inside him. He pulled his truck slowly into the narrow path, now cleared of overgrowth. What had once been forgotten land was now quietly revered. The Historical Society hadn't wasted time. After the Federal Review verified his findings, they worked with the county to protect the area as a local heritage site. No fences. No gift shop. Just a small sign at the front gate. Maddox Homestead, preserved September 2024. In memory of James, Clara, and Eli Maddox. Some voices echo beyond silence. A handful of volunteers had helped clean the place up, sweeping the barn, securing the roof, restoring the house enough to be safely walked through. But the heart of the transformation was inside the barn. What had once been a decaying structure filled with whispers now held a makeshift museum. Thomas stepped through the wide barn doors and took a long, slow breath. Everything was still there, not in their original positions but in respectful displays. The radio transceiver, cleaned and restored, sat on a wooden pedestal behind glass, wires neatly coiled, microphone resting beside the worn leather logbook. A small placard read, "Used by James Maddox between August and October, 1942. Recovered by his great-nephew, Thomas Mitchell. Believed to be part of a covert World War II communication experiment. Nearby, a long display case held the diary pages from Clara, preserved and framed. Her handwriting, elegant but urgent, curled across the paper like a voice frozen in time. Next to it were 3 faded photographs. One of James holding a rifle beside the barn, one of Clara and a child beside a wooden table, and one final, grainy photo of the 3 of them in front of the farmhouse. Above it all hung a quote, painted on reclaimed wood. "We weren't crazy. They used us. Please don't let them erase us." Thomas stood before it for a long time, hands in his pockets, eyes locked on the image of Clara's face. There was strength in her expression. Defiance. A quiet plea for someone, anyone, to believe her. "I believe you," Thomas whispered. Behind him, soft footsteps approached. It was Beth, the curator who had helped organize the Historical Society's involvement. "First visitor today," she said with a smile. "You know, none of this would have happened without you." Thomas shook his head. "It wasn't about me. It was about them." She nodded, then pointed toward the far end of the barn. "We found something else. Beneath the old floor in the house. You should see it." They walked together across the field, Hank following close behind as always. Inside the house, the rooms had been gently restored. Not modernized, just stabilized. Cracks patched, floorboards secured, windows cleaned but left old. It still smelled of time, of dust and pine and memory. Beth led him to the back room, what had once been Eli's bedroom. Beneath the small bed frame, the floor had been lifted. There, resting in a small hollowed space, was a wooden box. Inside, wrapped in cloth, was a bundle of hand-drawn sketches, childish but detailed. Crayons on brown paper. One drawing showed a man at a desk with a strange machine. Another was of a woman by a window. And one, folded many times and placed at the very bottom, showed a boy and a dog, sitting beneath a tall tree. Thomas felt his throat tighten. At the bottom of the box was a single line written in pencil. "Tell Eli he's safe now." He didn't ask who wrote it. He didn't have to. He left the drawing on the bed, walked out into the sun, and sat on the front porch with Hank beside him. He looked out over the field. Nothing moved. No shadows. No whispers. Just wind and light and a stillness that felt earned. For the first time since all of this began, Thomas didn't feel like he was trespassing on someone else's story. He felt like he'd helped complete it. He had uncovered more than a secret. He'd fulfilled a promise made by voices that never stopped trying to be heard. And in doing so, he understood something that had always eluded him. That some stories don't just survive time. They wait for the right person to find them. That day, as the sun began to dip behind the treetops, Thomas locked the barn one last time and placed the key in the Historical Society's lockbox. He turned to Hank. "We did it," he said. The dog wagged his tail, eyes shining. And together, they walked away from the past, carrying it forward, not as a burden, but as a legacy. It was Sunday, September 15th, 2024. The sun rose gently over the Maddox farm, casting long, golden rays across the field like the past reaching out to touch the present one last time. Thomas returned, not out of duty or curiosity this time, but something deeper. A sense of closure. Or maybe expectation. Hank walked slightly ahead, nose low, tail still. Something in his body language had changed since the discovery of the cellar. He was quieter, more alert, like he wasn't done yet. Thomas let him lead. They walked past the house, past the barn, toward a copse of trees at the far end of the property. The grass was taller here, wild and soft, swaying in the breeze. Hank stopped near an old oak, one Thomas hadn't noticed before. Its trunk was thick, bark worn smooth with age, roots bursting out from the earth like veins. Hank began digging. Thomas knelt beside him. The soil gave easily, as if it had waited to be moved. After a few minutes, Hank's paws hit something solid. A small metal box, no larger than a lunch tin, rusted but intact. Thomas carefully pulled it out, wiped away the dirt, and opened the latch. Inside was a folded cloth, frayed at the edges. He unwrapped it slowly. A single black and white photograph lay inside. It showed a child, maybe 5 or 6 years old, standing barefoot in front of the barn. The same barn. Same angle. But what stunned Thomas was the boy's face. It looked exactly like him. Same eyes. Same hairline. Even the faint dimple on the left cheek. His breath caught. He flipped the photo over. On the back, in faded pencil, was a name. Eli Thomas Maddox. Born October 3rd, 1937. He stared at the name for a long time. The middle name his own. A family name passed down. But he'd never known about Eli beyond the diary. Clara had written about her son in brief, loving fragments, but the records had gone dark after the war. Was this child his grandfather? A distant cousin? Could the boy in the photo be the missing link that tied all of this together? Thomas felt his heart pound. He looked at Hank. You knew, didn't you? The dog sat quietly, eyes locked on the photo. Then he looked up at the oak tree and let out a low, soft whine, not of distress but reverence. The moment felt suspended in time. The wind stilled. The leaves held their breath. Thomas placed the box gently back into the earth, rewrapped it, and left it where it belonged. He didn't need to take it. It had already delivered its message. The past had not only been uncovered, it had reached back to touch him. He stood in silence, overwhelmed not by answers but by the enormity of connection. Somehow, his journey had begun long before he stepped onto this land. Long before Duke had pulled him off the beaten trail. Maybe it had always been leading to this moment. Maybe the dog wasn't just following instinct. Maybe something or someone had been guiding them all along. He turned toward the house, then back toward the horizon. The line between generations had blurred. Clara's story, James's silence, Eli's disappearance. All of it had folded into this one quiet instant beneath an old oak tree. A bridge between what was and what remains. Some truths don't come as thunderclaps. They arrive as whispers, as paw prints in the soil, as a photo in a rusted box, showing you a face that mirrors your own. Back at the farmhouse, Thomas sat on the porch with Hank at his feet. He held the diary once more, flipped to the final page, and added a single line beneath Clara's last words. They heard you. I promise. He closed the book. Some stories demand to be found. Some legacies wait patiently in the shadows of trees. And some bonds stretch across lifetimes, impossible to explain, but undeniable. As the sky turned gold again and the farm settled into its soft quiet, Thomas leaned down and scratched Hank behind the ears. Let's go home. And with that, man and dog stepped off the porch, back into the world. Changed. Connected. Carrying with them not just history, but a purpose that echoed far beyond the fields of Wisconsin. Some bonds can't be explained, only followed. Now it's your turn. What lesson did you take from this story? Was it about legacy? Memory? Or maybe the idea that sometimes the truth waits for the right person, or the right heart, to find it? Let us know in the comments below. And if this journey moved you in any way, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and join us here on Wisconsin Farm Tales, where forgotten places tell unforgettable stories.